Welcome to Freethought Matters. I'm Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. We're executive directors of the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
Our topic today is the crisis over the politicized Supreme Court.
Our guest today is law professor Stephen Feldman, author of Pack the Court, a defense of Supreme Court expansion.
The Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces Freethought Matters, is the nation's largest association of free thinkers. That's atheists, agnostics, and other non-believers. We invite you to join us in our vital work to keep our secular government free from religious influence. Become a member at ffrf.org or ask for a complimentary copy of our newspaper, Freethought Today. Freedom depends on freethinkers. Watch prior episodes of Freethought Matters on FFRF's YouTube channel.
I'm Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. Can a politicized Supreme Court be corrected with expansion? Should it be expanded? Our guest today is Stephen M. Feldman, the Jerry W. Housel Carl F. Arnold Distinguished Professor of Law and Adjunct Professor of Political Science at the University of Wyoming. Dr. Feldman's books include The New Roberts Court, Donald Trump and Our Failing Constitution, Free Expressions and Democracy in America, A History, and Please Don't Wish Me a Merry Christmas, a critical history of the separation of church and state.
Professor Stephen Feldman's newest book is called Pack the Court. Note the exclamation. A defense of Supreme Court expansion. In this persuasive volume, he argues that the current Supreme Court is a serious threat to equality, fairness, and the rights of women, LGBTQ, and non-Christians.
In the book, Professor Feldman writes, "The Roberts Court has denigrated democratic government while shielding wealth and the economic marketplace. The court has protected whites and Christians while disregarding the interests of women, people of color, and non-Christians."
So, Professor Feldman, welcome to Freethought Matters.
Thank you for having me on the show.
So that's a very strong accusation to say that the Roberts Court has denigrated democratic government. And how has it done that?
Well, it's done that in at least a couple of ways. First of all, the court has repeatedly, and this goes back to the Rehnquist Court starting in the 90s, and the Roberts Court has continued doing it. It has invalidated or struck down congressional actions as being beyond constitutional power. So while the court for decades had largely deferred to the democratic process and upheld congressional actions, the court for the last 25 years has invalidated numerous congressional actions, particularly congressional actions that lean to the progressive or liberal side. Another way the court has undermined democracy is in cases involving direct challenges to the democratic process. There have been cases involving challenges to the Voting Rights Act where the court has invalidated or reduce the scope of the Voting Rights Act. And of course, those cases are in the news occasionally because the Roberts Court's decisions invalidating part of the Voting Rights Act has opened the floodgates to numerous state laws, new state laws that restrict suffrage, access to voting. And those cases are in the news quite often. When the court has had an opportunity to try to bolster or protect democracy, it hasn't done so. So like there was a recent case involving a challenge to extreme gerrymanders, and the court said, oh, we cannot decide this case. It's a so-called political question. It's beyond the court's domain, as if the court were actually apolitical. So whenever the court has a chance to strengthen or bolster democracy, it has not done so. It has actually undermined democracy, and it generally shows disdain for Congress.
So we want to talk about this idea of the politicized court and your thesis that the court really always has been political. But just briefly, attacks on the separation of church and state by the court, what would you say about that?
Oh, the court in recent years has turned significantly to the right, and this includes both in cases involving the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, the two religion clauses in the First Amendment. So, for instance, in Establishment Clause cases, the court has upheld the clergy delivered prayers at the beginning of a town council meeting. And these prayers, just to be clear, were overtly, expressly Christian, invoking Jesus Christ and our Savior on the cross and things like that. And the court said, based on tradition, these types of prayers are permissible, and that's just one example.
Yeah, the Greece versus Galloway case, and maybe you could talk a little bit about the Bladensburg Cross case that was so recent.
Yeah, and that's another great example that involved the display of a 32-foot Christian cross at a main intersection in Bladensburg. So this was a public display of a very, very large Christian cross, and once again, the court said that, we have a tradition of allowing these types of displays. Basically, what the court's doing in those Establishment Clause cases and where it emphasizes tradition, and also in free exercise cases, it's allowing or it's bolstering, in a sense, a view of the nation as de facto Christian is the way I read these cases. So the display of Christian symbols or the same Christian prayers is being protected on the one side, and on the other side, the court seems very worried about any perceived insults of or discrimination against Christians.
They don't seem concerned about the discrimination against non-Christians, though. It seems like they're, as your book points out, they're favoring the Christian, the rights that they have over the rights of those of us who are not religious. This court, as you point out, has become very, very conservative, religiously conservative.
Yes.
You write that the court is politicized. Is that true? Has the current Supreme Court become politicized, or has it always been?
I believe it's always been politicized. I think what has changed recently is that the justices, as is true with many Americans, the justices themselves are displaying more polarized political viewpoints. So the politics sometimes is more evident, and also we have, particularly since Amy Coney Barrett was confirmed and stepped into the seat that had been occupied by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, we now have a very large, strong conservative bloc. So it's a 6-3 conservative bloc, which makes the court even more conservative.
So how would you reform the court, as you say, pack the court? how would you do it? How many people? What would be involved?
Right. Well, that's one of the appeals of court expansion or packing the court. And I don't think there's anything wrong with calling it packing the court. I mean, some people object to the terminology and say, they'll argue, well, we can talk about court expansion, but not court packing. As if, if the Democrats were to add several justices, nobody would recognize that it was court packing. But the appeal is that it's so simple. All that has to happen is for Congress to pass a statute, and then the president nominate new justices. So Congress could pass a statute adding, given that we have a 6-3 conservative majority now, I'd like to see the addition of 4 new seats on the Supreme Court, and Congress would pass a statute adding 4 seats. The president would nominate potential justices, presumably on the progressive side, and then the Senate would confirm. Of course, the big sticking point here is getting Congress to actually do something, in particular, given the 50-50 split in the Senate. The only way this is going to happen would be to somehow get around the filibuster. And of course,
Yes.
That is a significant obstacle, but no more so with regard to court packing than it is with regard to anything else. For instance, passing a voting rights statute. So, one thing I think it's important to recognize is that the Constitution does not limit the size of the court.
Yes.
And in fact, the fact that Congress and the president can even threaten the Supreme Court in a sense with, well, we're so unhappy with what you're doing. You're so out of touch with the politics of the mainstream. We want to think about expanding the court. And this is what happened back in 1937 with Franklin Roosevelt and the New Dealers. That to me is a built-in part of the checks and balances of the Constitution. Right, the Supreme Court is politically insulated because justices are appointed for life; their salaries cannot be diminished. But to offset that political insulation, the Constitution does give Congress and the president the power to change the size of the court, and it has happened repeatedly throughout American history, particularly.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that there weren't always 9 justices. It's gone back and forth, right?
Correct. In over the first 100 years, Congress passed statutes changing the size of the court 7 times. In just the 1860s, obviously a politically volatile decade with the Civil War and Reconstruction, the size of the court was changed from 9 to 10 to 7 to 9. The original Supreme Court had 6 justices, so there's no magic number at 9. That happens to be where we've been for a long time. Although I would argue that the Republicans, Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans, reduced the size of the court to 8 for over a year when they refused to hold hearings on Merrick Garland. That was de facto reduction in the size of the court.
That's right. And to me, that is the greatest injustice that requires court reform, expansion, correction, whatever you want to call it, was that Barack Obama nominated somebody to replace Scalia, and Mitch McConnell stepped in so that Scalia, who was ultra-conservative, could not be replaced by an Obama nominee. And here we sit with Merrick Garland, our Attorney General, and he's now involved in this Texas case banning abortion, suing the state of Texas. Had he been appointed to the Supreme Court as he should have been, there should have been hearings, we wouldn't even be in this pickle with Texas because they wouldn't have had the votes. They would have been blocking that abortion ban. That shows you the harm of the true politicization of the court with Mitch McConnell.
Well, I think the court, as we can see, has already been packed. The religious conservatives are packing it with their politics. So your call to pack the court really, I think, is to balance it, to repack it or unpack it or to balance it in some way, because it's obvious the politics that are being played here. That's what your book is saying, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree that the Republicans have been particularly astute and successful in their manipulation of the federal judiciary, and it's really not just the Supreme Court, but the lower federal courts as well. And they have loaded up the federal judiciary with conservatives, and it's most stark on the Supreme Court, because after all, it's the Supreme Court, so we pay more attention to that court than the lower courts. And in some ways it's more important. But it's not as if the conservatives and the Republicans have not intentionally been trying to gain control of the Supreme Court. That's exactly what they've been doing, and they've been successful at doing it.
They've been very overt about it. When we come back, Professor Feldman, we want to talk a little bit more about the bad press that the term court packing has had, and a little bit more about what you think can be done to encourage Biden to do more about this. And we'll be right back with Freethought Matters.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist.
When I first recorded that commercial back in 2014, being openly atheist in America was still fairly uncommon. Today, the fastest growing religious group in the country is the non-religious, especially among the young. That progress is heartening, but the religious pushback is fierce and the forces of Christian nationalism are well organized. Our progress won't continue unless we work together so that reason and our secular constitution will prevail. That's why I'm asking you to join the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics working to keep state and church separate, just like our founders intended. Please join the Freedom from Religion Foundation today. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
And welcome back to Freethought Matters. We're talking with law professor Stephen Feldman about his new book with a provocative title, Pack the Court, a Defense of Supreme Court Expansion.
So we were talking earlier about the bad press that the term packing the court got, and most of that dates to FDR. And could we go just a tiny bit into that history of what happened there, Professor Feldman?
Sure. The Supreme Court in the 1930s had a conservative majority, and some of those justices had been in the court for a long time. And when FDR and the New Dealers came in the early 1930s and started passing New Deal type legislation, the court often invalidated those statutes. So the Supreme Court was a large obstacle to the implementation of the New Deal. And as it turned out, no Supreme Court justice retired or died during FDR's first term, running from 1932 to 1936. So he did not get any new appointees. And then in the November 1936 election, he was reelected by a landslide. And given that, he said, well, I don't want to sit around waiting for somebody to retire or pass away on the Supreme Court. Why don't we consider adding justices to the court? And he announced his court packing plan in February of 1937. Now, to be clear, there have been rumors of this possibility of some tinkering with the court. There have been rumors going around Washington, D.C. for months prior to his public announcement of the court packing plan. And there had been reports in the newspapers a couple of months earlier that something could happen. So Supreme Court justices knew that something might happen, and he announced this plan. And there were a lot of supporters of the plan. There also were a lot of critics of the plan, including some New Dealers didn't like the idea of tinkering with the Supreme Court. And what ultimately happened is that one of the conservative justices, the most moderate of the conservative justices on the court at that time, whose last name turned out coincidentally was Roberts, had no relation to our current Chief Justice John Roberts. This justice was named Owen Roberts. He flipped his vote from the conservative side to the more progressive side in a couple of key cases in early 1937, so after the announcement of the court packing plan. By the end of that term, one of the conservative justices had announced his retirement, and Roosevelt finally got his first nominee on the court. And then over the next few years, it was almost as if the floodgates had opened, and you have numerous retirements and deaths on the court. So by the early 1940s, Roosevelt had so many appointees on the court that it was being referred to as the Roosevelt Court. Now, what happened with the court packing plan is that once the court changed direction and started approving New Deal legislation, starting with those two cases early in 1937, there was less perceived need to change the court, but there was still a chance that the court packing plan might pass. And ultimately, what I think doomed the plan is that the Senate Majority Leader and a strong supporter of the plan, Senator named Joe Robinson, he unexpectedly died. So once he passed away, basically that was the end of the chances of the court packing plan. So the plan was defeated in Congress, but it did have the effect of the politics of the plan pressured. I mean, nobody knows how much, and this is historically disputed, how much did the politics of the court packing plan influence Owen Roberts to flip his vote. I think it's naive to think that Owen Roberts was not influenced at all.
So I have a question for you, though.
Sure.
It doesn't look like that's apt to happen here. I mean, President Biden commissioned a group of people and did to look at this issue of correcting the Supreme Court, but didn't even tell them to make recommendations, and they came up with a very tepid reaction. And I think we're seeing some defensiveness by the current Supreme Court. You know, we're not a bunch of partisan hacks, according to Amy Coney Barrett and so on. But they really have the votes to undo many basic court precedents for individual liberties right now, and they look like they're about to do it, don't you think? That's not apt to happen here unless some action is taken, right?
Right, and we talked about the religion cases earlier. The court, that's one area where the court clearly has already changed direction, right? So the court has moved distinctly to the right in religion cases, religious freedom cases involving the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. And of course, in the news now is the potential for the court to either eliminate the right to choose whether to have an abortion, so completely overrule Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the two most important cases involving a right to choose. Or what's another possibility here is the court simply continues to hollow out the right to choose. And to be clear, the right to choose that exists today is not the same right to choose that the court recognized in Roe versus Wade. So in other words, the court has hollowed out or diminished that right significantly over the years. and the court can continue going in that direction.
So
but
1 minute
yeah,
left,
there's
Professor
great
Feldman.
potential.
1 minute left. There are critics. How would you answer them who say this idea of packing the court to rebalance it would reduce the legitimacy of the court?
Yeah, and that's an important question. And I'll try to be quick. Basically, there's two lines of political science research which suggests that is not true, that packing the court would not undermine the court's legitimacy. If anything, it might actually enhance the court's legitimacy. One line of political science research says that the court has a reservoir of goodwill. This is called positivity bias in favor of the court. So anything that brings attention to the court, even a court backing plan, is likely to reinforce public perception that it likes the court. The other line of political science research says it's really more a matter of one's political orientation. So if you like what the court's doing now because you're very conservative, then you probably wouldn't like a court packing plan. But if you think the court is too conservative, and I think if you just look at the last presidential vote, the popular vote in the presidential election suggests that there is a majority of people who are more on the Democratic side than the Republican side, and they would likely be pleased by changing the court's makeup.
Well,
they would be
you.
happy to see it become more
Thank
progressive.
you, Professor Feldman, for joining us today. Your book is very persuasive.
And very provocative. It's going to be the issue that we are dealing with here at the Freedom from Religion Foundation for many years as we are facing so many attacks on this court precedent. So we really appreciate your joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me on this show. I really enjoyed it.
And thank you for watching Freethought Matters.
Because free thought matters.
Hi, I'm Steve Pinker. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I show that the world has become a better place as reason has been overcoming superstition and tribalism. But the values of the Enlightenment are under attack. That's why I'm a proud member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest association of free thinkers working to keep state and church separate. Please join me in supporting the Freedom from Religion Foundation to ensure that our government is driven not by religion, but by reason.